Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Andrew Samwick, and I'm a professor of economics and the director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center here at Dartmouth. At the Rockefeller Center, we have for over a decade started our fall term programming with Constitution Day and ended it with Veterans Day. These two holidays commemorate, respectively, the framework for the nation's government and the human side of perhaps the most consequential decisions that a nation's government can take, which is when to deploy its military forces. Our nation's history with veterans has been a complicated one, particularly in the half-century since the start of the Vietnam War, in which it has become very clear that not all citizens bear the burden of military service in anything like equal amounts. In the wake of the Vietnam War, we made the mistake of taking out our frustrations with senior leadership's design and conduct of the war on the soldiers who fought the war, many of them draftees. More recently, in an era without compulsory military service, we have taken great pains not to make this particular mistake. But I fear that the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction, such that we make the opposite mistake of transferring the well-earned civic pride in the service, the sacrifice, and even the heroism of our veterans to their senior leadership, who don't necessarily deserve it. The result, predictably, has been military engagements fought under dubious premises and without clear objectives for victory and thus their termination. Those long engagements, without the full mobilization of the civilian population, have in turn led to continued challenges of reintegrating veterans into civilian society after discharge. If we do not design benefit and care programs to address the challenges that veterans face, and if we do not fund them to meet the needs of all veterans who qualify, then we leave ourselves open to episodes like the tragedy in Thousand Oaks, California last week, and the many, many more instances where the burdens of prior service are borne solely by the veterans themselves and their close families, often in silence and isolation. It is a truism in public policy, and any social science for that matter, that you will seldom go wrong by gathering more evidence. In this case, that means listening to veterans and their stories of the defining moments in their service and the challenges and opportunities of transitioning back to civilian life. We are quite fortunate to have with us this afternoon two Dartmouth graduates, Jason Hartwig and Brad Wolcott, both Army veterans and classmates from the class of 2006, who can reflect on the imprints and consequences of the war. We have set this up not as a formal lecture, but less formally as a conversation, first between Jason and Brad, and then widening the discussion to include all of us. Jason Hartwig served 5 years as an armor officer in the United States Army, leading a tank platoon during the deployment to Baghdad, Iraq from March 2008 through March 2009, and a reconnaissance platoon in Kandahar, Afghanistan from July 2010 to July 2011. Following his military service, he worked in the Department of Justice as part of a program designed to deliver training and assistance to foreign police forces in post-conflict and fragile states. He is an expert in security sector reform with more than a decade of experience. Most recently, he worked for the U.S. mission to Somalia in a position using military assistance to support building security institutions and incentivizing political agreements. He is a security sector reform specialist and is currently working on launching a company. He majored in history at Dartmouth and continued his education with a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown University. Brad Wolcott served as a cavalry officer in the U.S. Army from 2006 through 2010, including 13 months in Iraq as a scout platoon leader from March 2008 to May 2009. After his discharge in 2010, Brad entered North Bennett Street School in Boston to pursue a love for design and woodworking. He discovered that passion as a student at Dartmouth at the Hopkins Center Woodworking Studio. After graduating from North Bennett, he worked for 3 years as a studio furniture maker and woodworking instructor before being recruited to lead the design and engineering department at a startup contract furniture maker. His new venture is Confluence Design. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jason Hartwig and Brad Wolcott.
All right.
I go first, Brad?
Sure. So my name is Brad Wolcott. Thank you, Professor Samwick, for introducing us. And I think that Jason and I talked about this conversation. We just want to start off by giving a little more information on our experience. So after I graduated in 2006, I started off my career at Fort Sill in Oklahoma and then Fort Knox for the basic Armor Officers Leader course. And then I was stationed in Germany afterwards with the 2nd Brigade, 1st Armor Division, and spent 2 years as a platoon leader with the Brigade Reconnaissance Troop, including 13 months in Iraq, and then my final year in the Army as an executive officer for that troop. So my experience throughout was at the company level, serving in a line unit. So, Jason.
Yeah, and so Brad and I were classmates in ROTC. We were roommates, good friends, hunting buddies, spent a lot of time together. We actually were even roommates at Fort Knox during our basic training for the Armor Officer course. And then we took very sort of divergent paths. He wisely chose to be stationed in Germany, and I ended up in Fort Hood, Texas. So we ended up deploying to Iraq at the same time. I was leading a tank platoon. I spent my entire Army career in the same infantry battalion, 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry, in the 4th Infantry Division. So I did a deployment at sort of the tail end of the surge in Iraq and Baghdad, which was, we'll talk about it. It was the best, worst times of life. And then we redeployed. I kind of thought I was going to get out of the Army. My 4 years was coming up. And we ended up being identified as one of the surge brigades for Afghanistan. And so we received orders as I was kind of hoping to get out, to go to Kandahar. And at about the same time, I was selected to be the battalion reconnaissance leader, scout platoon leader. So it was kind of a prestigious job. And I had the privilege to sort of have a 2nd platoon and train up a platoon of soldiers to take into combat, and then did another year in Kandahar. And so ultimately I ended up leading about 600 combat patrols across Iraq and Afghanistan. Like Brad, never really went above the platoon level, so had a very granular view of the war, for better or worse. I think we saw such a small part of the war that it's hard, we can only speak of our part of the conflict. I mean, we aren't really well situated to speak to the broader decisions. I mean, the 2nd position I did, I was working for the brigade commander briefly, so I did have the opportunity to look at when Defense Secretary Gates came for one visit. Petraeus came frequently and got to be a fly on the wall staffing the brigade commander as we came up with sort of broader policy and strategic goals for Kandahar. And then I followed Brad and got out and have been working in the security sector, in security sector reform since then. But I think we wanted to talk a little bit, about what drew us down these paths. So, Brad, I remember you weren't on scholarship initially for ROTC. What brought you into ROTC and ultimately military service?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that makes our cohort a little unusual is that when we entered Dartmouth, the war had already begun, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so unlike a lot of other year groups, both past and present, who found themselves at war after joining in a time of peace, we were joining in a time of war with the expectation that we were going to be deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. As Jason will mention, the hope was always Afghanistan, but things turned out differently than you expect. As Jason mentioned, I chose Dartmouth because it had an ROTC program. I knew that I wanted to be an Army officer growing up, not from any particular family connection, but because I believed that public service was important, and I felt that the best way that I could serve was to be a combat leader in the military. And I felt that that was what best suited my personality traits and interests. So coming to Dartmouth, I joined ROTC during orientation and then received a ROTC scholarship my final 2 years at Dartmouth before beginning my active duty career. And the motivations other than that are hard to define. It's I think for so many it's just a calling, and it's hard to put into words why you're influenced to feel that way. And particularly when we were here, Jason and I are both on the more liberal side of the political spectrum. So joining the military in a time of war, in a war that we didn't agree with the principles behind it, can often seem strange to people. And I think that, from my perspective, the best way to describe that is the granular view that Jason mentioned that we had of these conflicts was centered around like a small group of people. And I felt that by serving, that I could provide the kind of leadership at that level that would do credit to the United States. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but if you're gonna have a professional force out fighting America's wars, then you want it to be staffed by people who believe in the ideal America and want to uphold that and uphold our position in the world as a leader and a beacon for the things that are right. Whether we always live up to that or not can certainly be discussed. So, yeah, for me that was the rationale. Jason?
Yeah, so I grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My father worked for the Park Service as a historian, so I kind of grew up around military history and things like the Gettysburg Address and monuments. And so the sort of memory of war was just a part of me growing up. And I was that kind of like stereotypical kid, like reading books about war, thinking about like how fantastic this will be, and it's a chance to defend your nation and sacrifice and have interesting experiences. And so I, like you, Brad, I came in on a scholarship actually for ROTC, so I was applying for ROTC scholarships and West Point, and it was kind of a decision to go a civilian route of schooling and stick with ROTC. And obviously September 11th happened. Both our I guess you took a gap year, so it was my senior year of high school. It was you just graduated. And I mean, obviously that was that unfolded on our television screens in I think it was like second period for me. And so you did feel this visceral, the nation had been attacked. And so you sort of wanted to go to Afghanistan, and then our freshman year we decided to invade Iraq. And like Brad, I kind of had the same attitude that, while I feel the country is taking the wrong path, we ultimately democratically elected this government. At the time, the Democrats kind of went along with the invasion. So even the liberal side of the spectrum, unfortunately, wasn't much of a check. And so we kind of made this bed, and now we had to live in it. And I think I didn't meet many people at Dartmouth who thought like, oh, I'm just going to be like a person and kind of go out into the world and do my thing and not change it very much. Like, you and I very much thought like, we're going to get there, we're going to change how the military works, like we're going to change the prosecution of the war, and it's going to be fantastic. And obviously you get there, and one of the greatest ironies with war is that you read so much about how terrible it is, and yet there's always a generation of young men and increasingly women who want to go experience it. And then you get to it, and it's as awful as advertised. It's always going to be like the worst thing that ever happens to you. But it's also, I think there's a saying I've heard before that I really agree with. It's the best, worst days. That you work with absolutely fantastic people. You work with complete sadists, and you work with some of the best people you're ever going to meet. And you share something, particularly in a place like Iraq, where I was in Baghdad, of an urban area that you sort of bridge this cultural gulf where, as a platoon, where we were completely outnumbered. We had 60 American soldiers in a neighborhood of 200,000 people. Like, we weren't going to impose our will on them. So it was really a sort of shared experience of this cultural interaction of, Iraqis realizing that me and my soldiers just kind of wanted to go home. And a lot of them didn't even realize we'd volunteered to go to Iraq. They thought that we were all conscriptees. And then we kind of learned that, Iraqis just wanted peace ultimately. And obviously through a series of pretty disastrous decisions we made in Iraq, we sort of instigated a horrendous civil war. But at the point that Brad and I were there, we were kind of the finger in the dike, preventing a continued escalation of the violence. So it's funny how, it completely changes how you think about the war. That, I wish I'd never had to go to war, but at the same time, I don't regret the decisions that took me there.
Yeah, and I think the decisions that take you there and your experience there, I think it impacts you in ways that are far different than a lot of civilians understand. I was talking with Joanne from the Rockefeller Center about how the things that you learn about yourself in combat aren't necessarily always related to the combat itself. Being in a world in which your sole job is to go out and patrol every day, you have no other concerns. You're not, at least I should rephrase that, because at the time I was not married, I did not have children. So my real ties to the outside world were more limited. Now certainly with soldiers, with families and children, there's always that stress of separation. But for me at that point, I was not married and did not have children, and the sort of all the concerns of the civilian world just fade away. And it's liberating in a way that's difficult to explain. You don't have to worry about bills. You don't have to worry about your food. You don't have to worry about your car. You don't have to worry about anything except for doing your job every day. And in that freedom from the, honestly, the haze that surrounds you in civilian life, you recognize the things that are really important to you. So, when I was in Iraq, I didn't think about how much money I was going to make in my lifetime. I didn't think about, what my house was going to look like. I didn't think about anything like that. I thought about my family and my friends and hunting, fishing, and designing things, honestly. So, and that clarity and that peace I've never had again. And it's a strange dichotomy because, you come off you go out on patrol, and if any of you have ever, there's a body of literature about veterans' experience versus green recruits and the way that veterans relate to combat, and the primary stress is before you leave the gate. And that's what I always found. As you're planning the operation, as you're preparing to leave, this just overwhelming pressure and fear about what would happen when you leave the gate. But once you leave the gate, it just clicks and it all goes away, and you're just sort of in the zone, I guess, would be a sort of popular phrase for it. And whereas, people who haven't experienced it are like, oh, this won't be that bad, and then they go out the gate and they're terrified. But then you get back to base, and there's sort of this unwinding period, and I think the thing that most people don't understand about the military is that 99% of the military life is just totally boring. You're fueling up your truck, you're writing your patrol debrief, you're talking with your intel cell about what you learned that day, you're sitting at the DFAC eating another peanut butter and jelly sandwich because they don't have lunch on a combat outpost. And you're just left with your thoughts. And in Iraq, you're just not concerned with all the things that you're concerned with in civilian life that can seem so overwhelming.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing from the platoon leader time I had, and I felt it more in Iraq as, a new platoon leader, when you have very little moral authority with your soldiers, is just how alone you were on a combat outpost. There was no one for you, because you had no peer, there was no one for you to talk to about how you felt. And a combat patrol, like I felt like I lived a lifetime when things were bad. You would, the amount, I mean, one, you would interact with hundreds of people frequently, and you would go maybe from responding to an IED and cleaning up the aftermath of, you know, a brutal terrorist attack, to interacting with police and, you know, trying to provide like on-the-job training, to then giving out microloans, to then needing to extract yourself from something and just living in utter terror, thinking you're about to be ambushed. And the decision, like, no one could make the decisions for you. And I was 24 at the time, and you're surrounded by a bunch of non-commissioned officers who all have, at that point, like infinitely more experience than you have, and somehow you've been deemed to be competent enough to be in charge. And yeah, you made decisions that the moment after you made it, you were like, that was absolutely the wrong decision. And like your soldiers reminded you of that. I mean, soldiers, like, I think we've got this sense that like soldiers are just like, yes sir, and sort of follow along with it. Like if they think they received an idiotic order, they're gonna tell you that. And your sergeants will tell you that. And then you go back to the base and you kind of sequester yourself away to lick your wounds and reevaluate the decisions you've made. And that, I mean, the amount of time you spend with your thoughts can be, I mean, to me, it was both liberating and then also terrifying, because you could just go so many dark places by yourself. So you had to sort of develop hobbies to do, to deal with the boredom and tedium of being deployed. I mean, so for me, I never took the classics course here, the freshman year. I don't know if they still have the course where you take, read all the classic Western literature. So I just brought like a tough box full of all of the novels I'd never read. And so I just taught myself like interwar literature. And it was fantastic. And to me, one of the things that was most powerful, I was reading War and Peace and seeing just how timeless the experience was.
I read War and Peace there too.
You got a lot of time, so you can get through War and Peace. Yeah. But there was, despite the differences in translation and that, the Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was very different than the conflict we were experiencing, the basic experience of war was no different. And I could see myself, one, it was fantastic to imagine yourself at like these great balls, as opposed to, the combat outpost I was in Baghdad on half rations. But, to me, that sort of knowledge of, yeah, it was really lonely, but this is an experience that millions of humans have had across history, was also really empowering. And it's one of those moments of being able to feel the human experience in a more real fashion than I think I ever have and ever will since. And it's moments like that I'm appreciative of the experience that I had. Mm-hmm. But Brad, I don't know, do you want to talk about some of the more difficult moments you had?
Yeah, certainly.
And how that formed you?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of my Iraq experiences can be sort of contained within a 1 month period that my brigade was tasked with securing an Al-Qaeda sort of safe haven southwest of Aqaba, Iraq, which is outside. And so we did a battalion air assault into this remote series of villages in Diyala province. At a time when, the violence in Iraq was still sporadic and localized, and this was an area that was known to be a safe haven for Al-Qaeda cells bringing vehicle-borne IEDs and suicide bombers into Aqaba and Baghdad. And so my platoon was selected to secure an isolated objective that was connecting two of the the primary company objectives along like a major route that ran through the area, and so we loaded up onto CH-47s and air assaulted into this village at night. And so the first thing I'll talk about is fear. We were sitting on the CH-47, and I was at the back because as platoon leader, it was my job to lead the soldiers off the helicopter when we landed. And we had a Apache attack helicopter flying cover out the side of the window. And we'd been in Iraq for 2 months at that point, and we had been involved in direct fire engagements, and had seen IED strikes and RPG attacks and stuff like that. But we were flying in, and I looked out, and we got the word from the crew chief that we were 5 minutes out, and the Apache, which at that point I did not realize had a infrared locating light, like a spotlight essentially, that was mounted coaxially with the Gatling gun that sticks off the front of the Apache. So we got the notification that we were 5 minutes out. We got the notification that we were 1 minute out, and then I see the front of the Apache light up with what I later determined was the Apache was designating the landing zone for the helicopter to go in. But at that time, my initial reaction was the LZ's hot, the Gatling gun is firing, and I'm watching tracers flying out the front of it, and I was just like, holy shit, we're going in hot, and we're under fire. And we landed and came off the back of the helicopter, and it took off again. It was like 1 a.m. and my platoon was on an isolated objective, so we were by ourselves. The rest of my troop was 2 miles away up the road, and then the rest of the company from the company that was adjacent to us was 1.5 miles down the road. And the helicopter took off, and it was just silence. And sort of that realization that we weren't under fire when we landed was crazy. But that fear, just sitting there in this plane was the most afraid I had ever been, and was in Iraq, even when we were getting hit by IEDs and stuff like that, because that unknown, you don't know what you're going into. And then we proceeded to spend the next month in the desert clearing these small villages in this area and trying to basically deal with the local population and try and gather as much intelligence about what was going on. And the Iraqi Prime Minister had helpfully announced the offensive 2 days before we air assaulted in, so all of the local al-Qaeda representatives had planted all of their IEDs on every road, bridge crossing, field, throughout the area. And so we began taking daily deep buried and stacked anti-tank mine hits on vehicles, and in 3 weeks we lost 8 vehicles to IED strikes and mines, and in a place where we were alone on isolated objective, just trying to get by and do the mission. And it was an incredible test for me to maintain sort of your composure and provide soldiers with the reassurance that what we were doing was beneficial. And we were, the last part about this experience was that in our 8 catastrophic strikes, we had 0 significant casualties because Jason and I arrived in Iraq at the point where the Humvees and up-armored Humvees were being replaced with the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles. So we lost 2 Bradleys and 6 MRAPs that they were called. And a year earlier, we would have suffered devastating casualties because they were, at that point, they were dragging up-armored Humvees as decoys because the IEDs had a sophistication and they were using Soviet anti-tank mines that were oftentimes rigged with like Italian trigger switches that were multi-strike detonated. So 1, 2, 3 vehicles would drive over the mine and then it would blow up and blow up the 3rd vehicle. And the idea is that in American doctrine, the leadership of the platoon rides in the 3rd, 4th, 5th vehicle depending on the configuration of the unit. And that those devices were designed to kill people like Jason and I who were in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th vehicle. And fortunately, the Humvees that we saw being towed as decoys, when they would blow up, were just like obliterated, folded in half, thrown into canals, and the MRAPs would, like the front would blow off, and the crew compartment would stay intact, and like all of our soldiers survived, and without significant injury. So we were just incredibly fortunate, and that was sort of the overarching sort of tenor of my deployment was unfortunately the mistakes that were made at the beginning had been rectified to an extent that saved a lot of lives. We had experiences later on with explosively formed projectiles, which some of you may have read about or heard about in the media. For those of you who are old enough to remember the 2008 time frame, they were basically like copper discs that were turned into molten projectiles and were extremely lethal. And we had a couple of those strikes later on in the deployment, and the MRAP stopped those as well. And it was, so just incredibly fortunate. But that time frame was that mission, that time was pretty formative for me, and definitely, just came out with this sense of relief that's impossible to describe. One of my NCOs stepped on a landmine and missed the trigger. So we were walking down like a canal road, and he stepped on the landmine and took a couple steps, and then the guy behind him was like, "Holy shit, that's a landmine." And there's like looks like a little mushroom sticking up in the dirt, and we called an EOD, and it was like a large Soviet anti-tank mine with like a dual-purpose Italian trigger. That dual purpose being that the detonator was built to function under the extreme pressure of a vehicle, but also as an anti-personnel device. So, and he missed it by inches, and we were just like, he was married with kids, and we were sitting there at the base after we got back, and just could not believe the fortune that we had that hadn't turned out differently. And I'll spare you the black humor of the military, but it was an experience. So for me, that was definitely the most difficult month, and sort of defined my experience there. Jason?
I guess because I did 2 deployments and had the opportunity to sort of build on my mistakes at the first one and try and rectify them in the second deployment. I had 2 sort of different experiences. The first deployment was the more typical platoon leader of trying to build a rapport with guys who are much better at your job than you are. But it was also, Brad and I deployed at about a time when we were changing how we were prosecuting the war. That my unit, the previous deployment, were very much shoot first. ask questions later. And so they caused a lot of civilian casualties. And there was a theory that that's partially what was driving the intensity of the insurgency that we were seeing. And so Brad and I were part of a generation of officers that were essentially part of a project of retraining the Army to conduct what we called counterinsurgency. So the idea that we're going out to win the hearts and minds of the people. And I think Brad and I both bought very much into that doctrine. And so trying to get your soldiers to go along with you, I felt like at times like I was like the captain of like a pirate ship or something, that like if we were getting intelligence and we were conducting interesting raids and we were capturing insurgents, then everyone was kind of happy. And then there were times where we would go a month without anything, and suddenly like I wasn't very popular, sitting in air conditioning, drinking tea with people, developing intelligence, while my soldiers pulled security outside in like the 110-degree heat. And so managing that and trying to get your soldiers to believe that they should trust this 24-year-old, right out of college, that he knew what he was doing to take you on the right path, was, always a challenge, and took, almost 6 months to overcome, to build enough trust for soldiers to follow me. But then, going to Afghanistan, I had the opportunity to train this platoon, and it was, very much trained exactly in the image that I wanted. And we were a scout platoon, so we were supposed to be the most lethal element in the battalion. And so, we were supposed to be guys going out, doing ambushes, raids ahead of the battalion. And about 2 weeks before we deployed, our mission was changed to provide security for the brigade commander. That apparently I was selected because he heard that I was a fan. Our sophomore summer, I went on tour with Fish. I don't know if anyone knows like the jam band. And so he heard that. He said, well, I want the guy who's the scout platoon leader who's like a hippie and follows Fish. So for us, it was really devastating that, we planned to be the tip of the spear. And for me, it was coming from Iraq. It was like, yeah, this is why I joined the Army. Like, we're going to go get after the Taliban. And then suddenly we were essentially security guards. But part of the reason we were selected was the brigade commander wanted to get to hard places. So we still needed to maintain the professionalism and sort of lethality of a combat unit. And so on our off days, I would take the platoon out on combat patrols. And Kandahar was like a really violent place in July 2010. And so there were a couple incidents where we were missed by vehicle-borne IEDs that caused an enormous number of casualties. And so one particular incident, a car bomb blew itself up next to an American convoy about a mile down the road from us. We were doing a dismounted patrol in a sort of a city square. And again, we were given fantastic vehicles, and every American soldier walked away completely fine from that blast. It killed about 50 Afghans, though, and essentially leveled a city block. And so we maneuvered to it and were the first unit on the ground and sort of established security. And obviously the unit that we were relieving, it was not a combat unit. They were pretty shooken up. And so we kind of took over the scene for them. But afterwards, my sergeants confronted me and they were like, why were we out there? Like, our job is to protect the brigade commander. You were putting us at unnecessary risk. And so it was this, it was a profound leadership challenge of trying to communicate to them that, one, you're soldiers and like our job is still to go out and be providing security even on our off days, but then also the way that we make ourselves more secure when we're doing our mission is by still being combat soldiers. And that means, we all signed up for this and these are the inherent risks in it. And so it was hard at times talking with your soldiers about their lives. There was another, you kind of piece, I don't know if you did it, Brad, but I would select the order of the patrol kind of based on the attributes of soldiers, but then also expendability of just because we were such an undermanned unit that if we lost our best leaders, like I wasn't sure we would win a fight. And so you kind of had your most expendable guys in the lead vehicle, and they brought that up to me one day, and I just kind of had to walk them through, can you call in an airstrike? Can you call in a medevac? Can you do all of these things that were going to be the things that we had to do after a terrible event would happen, and just sort of see the disappointment in their face of them recognizing that, like, yeah, this is going to continue to be their job. And at that point, I was more seasoned, but I was still like 26 years old. And again, you kind of go back to your bunk and you're like, am I actually making the right decision? And I mean, I'm still like haunted by that stuff today. And then I mean, to your point, and to the opening point of the disconnect between those who served and sort of the leadership they had. When we were first transitioning into Afghanistan, we were replacing this outgoing unit that had had a very rough go, and it sustained a lot of casualties. And we're led by a brigade commander who was subsequently fired almost immediately upon getting home. So he wasn't the best and brightest. And I was going around with my incoming brigade commander, and when units switch out, they call it a right seat, left seat ride. And so the outgoing unit will be driving the vehicles, and then the incoming unit will be commanding the vehicles. So I was in the lead vehicle, and one of their sergeants was driving, and I was commanding the lead truck. And a firefight broke out in an outpost we were visiting about 400 meters away from us. And in Afghanistan, in southern Afghanistan, the foliage was so thick that, I mean, there could be multiple firefights and battles being engaged, within a mile of you. And it was just, it was almost like the Bocage country or something, if any of you are familiar with World War II history in Normandy after D-Day. And this brigade commander decides that us as a security element are going to go and flank the Taliban. And there was like one road. And I don't know if there's any military veterans here, but like the one thing you never do in combat is go down a road where a battle just began that you haven't done any reconnaissance on. And so I asked the outgoing unit, have you ever been down this road? They said no. I look at it on the map. I'm not completely sure we can even get out. And these are sort of farm lanes in Afghanistan, so the walls are so high that your machine guns can't actually see over it, and there's no way for you to turn around. And so we end up driving to this road, and kind of that, what you're talking, the fear you experience in that air assault. I looked down this, it was essentially like looking down a tunnel. And I hadn't been in Afghanistan very long, but I'd been in Iraq, and I knew that insurgents just don't leave a flank open. Like this road was clearly IED'd. And you were completely powerless because this senior leader had said, like, we're gonna go down this road, this thing that you knew was completely insane and idiotic. And I turned to the crew. So I was the only guy from my unit. Everyone else was from the outgoing unit. And I said, guys, rank doesn't matter here anymore. Like if we go down this road, we're all gonna die. Like tell me what I need to say so we don't drive down this road and be killed. I mean, it's the most scared I've ever been, because it was literally, you saw your impending doom in front of you, and you knew how wrong it was, and some guy who was about to be fired in 2 weeks was telling you to go do it. And unfortunately, my brigade commander intervened and concluded the entire episode. But that's always stuck with me of, as I've progressed in my career, working in the security sector, to always remember that, like, at the end of the day, like, war always has some poor guy trying to make this terrible, impossible decision and ensure that you've set that person up as best you can, that they feel confident with what they're about to do, and not be that guy who was like going over the top of the Somme saying, what we're about to do is complete insanity and there's nothing I can stop this, that will inevitably result in myself and several of my soldiers being killed or maimed. So that's, an experience that probably I think back to more than anything as I've grown older and have moved into positions to influence more policy, to think about, like, if you take anything from being a junior combat leader, ensure that, like, you never put other people in the position that you felt when you were at your worst.
Yeah. Yeah, we, Jason and I talked before we sat down about what we want to talk about with you guys, and we want to open this up to questions. Before we do that, we just wanted to touch on one topic that I think is really relevant to the students here, which is just our experience with leadership and what defines good leadership, and how that translates to the civilian world. We've seen a lot of the best and the worst kinds of things. So, Jason, if you could just sort of define what your experience of leadership and what you think defines good leadership and how that translates, so we can, and I'll do the same, and then we'll open up to questions from you guys.
Yeah, I mean, leadership's a really tricky thing. I mean, I think it's funny that, like in ROTC, you're supposed to be trained as a leader. But I mean, I do think a lot of stuff in leadership is kind of you learn via trial and error. And I mean, I guess the good thing that ROTC did is it put you in leadership positions. So you made a bunch of mistakes over 4 years running around in the woods back behind the sports facilities and then out in Washington. And so I think the first thing is you need to develop a bit of an identity as a leader. And I think that translates over into anything. You need to kind of identify who you are as a person and how you carry yourself. Are you more of the charismatic type of leader? Are you more of the technical type of leader? Do people follow you because they're drawn to you? Do people follow you because you're just extremely proficient at whatever task you're supposed to be doing? So I mean, I found that was one part that was extremely important in the military. And in the military, it's going to take a different form because your ego was allowed to flourish much more in the military. You're allowed to be much more aggressive, bombastic. I definitely kind of went down that path of maybe a bit more of a colorful leader, whereas I think Brad was probably always a bit more reserved. But you need to find the limits of that, and obviously coming out of the military, that style of leadership was a much more difficult one to tailor to an environment where thankfully you don't treat everyone the way you do in the combat arms in the military. And then I think the other thing I took away from it is when you're at a place like Dartmouth doing ROTC, like everyone around you is really motivated and really talented, and so you just sort of assume that's going to be the Army. And like while there were lots of talented people in the Army, like the Army fundamentally is an enormous organization, and it's based on, particularly in the combat arms, like expendability. That the idea that like this part is just as good as the next part, everyone's replaceable, and you're just kind of given a platoon, and you actually go through the personalities of the platoon. And you're like, this unit kind of sucks. Like everyone's kind of fat, and they're not very fit, and doesn't really seem anyone wants to be here. But then turning that into an organization that, obviously both deployments I had, you had an end date that like you had to be good by, March 3rd, 2008, or you had to be good, prior to July 1st, 2010, because you were, about to go to the ultimate test. But it was figuring out, recognizing what your weakest link was, but then not dwelling on that weakest link, but instead realizing that even the weakest member of your team had some type of attribute, and it was incumbent on you as a leader to figure out what that attribute was and put them in a position to succeed. And one thing I always remember from Major Carver, one of our instructors, is he said he never put a subordinate leader in a position to fail him. And that's a lesson that I still look to today, of just don't recognize people's shortcomings, put them in a position to succeed, and you're going to be really impressed with the results frequently from the team. But if you put them in a position to fail, you're not helping anyone out ultimately.
Yeah.
So I mean, to me, those are the sort of two biggest applicable lessons.
Yeah. And for me, I think the thing is that people have this belief that military leadership is predicated on rank, and that because you wear a gold bar or railroad tracks, that you're that soldiers are just gonna be like, Roger, sir, like I'll do whatever, like send me through that door. But the reality is that's not the case. People will follow orders from Army officers, because they have to or because they want to, and that's a pretty powerful difference. And from my experience, as Jason mentioned, I was a quieter leader, but leadership to me was predicated on technical and physical excellence. So whatever job you have in the civilian world, if you're going to have people working for you, you need to know how to do their job, and you need to be better at it than they are. So for us, that was qualifying expert with every weapon system. It was outperforming them at physical training. It's being able to ruck further with a heavier pack. It was, being able to put yourself in the most difficult positions that you would expect anybody else to be in. And I think all those things relate to the civilian world. what I've learned from the civilian world after I've gotten out of the military is that leadership is the most valuable commodity that you can have when you graduate. And the ability, it's the most valuable commodity on the marketplace, because the ability to lead and motivate others will separate you from people who are merely good at doing something. Most of you will leave here and you will start off in a position where you're doing something. But the people who progress are the people who are able to lead those people who are doing something and create an environment that, as Jason mentioned, pushes them to reach their potential, which is, kind of a cliche phrase in society, but the reality is that whatever civilian job you work in, you're going to have what I will call subordinates, but colleagues, coworkers, many of whom probably don't want to be there. Maybe they've been there for 30 years, maybe they're just checking out till retirement. But in order for your organization to function at its highest level, you need to find out how to motivate them and inspire them and push them to do the best work that they can. And the way that you do that is to show that you care about them, that you respect their opinions and their experience. You listen to what they have to say, whether you take that advice or not. Because when you're a leader, your position, your responsibility is to accumulate or assemble all the information that you have available and then to use that to make the best decision possible. And it may not be popular. And the best leaders are the ones who can take the unpopular decisions that they know are right and push the organization beyond the point of stasis or laziness that it has reached. Because lots of organizations reach points at which things work pretty well. I've been here for a long time. This is how we've always done things. I saw it in the military. I've seen it in the civilian world. That's just how we do things, sir. You do that because it's the right thing, or it's because the way you've always done it? And if you want to create the best organization possible, and you want to progress, whatever you want to do, you have to be able to assemble that information and make the best decision and get other people to buy into it, and convince them or cajole them, or sort of create a environment where you're respected for your expertise and they follow you because they trust you and because they want to. So I'm not a Machiavellian, I guess. Unless you have anything else to say, we'd like to open it up to questions and start having a conversation with you guys. So, go ahead.
What advice do you have? What advice do you have for women trying to pursue combat arms careers?
I think that the advice that I gave you just still stands, and probably even more so. For whether we as a society want to acknowledge it or not, women who are joining combat arms are coming in at a disadvantage. There is a belief that they are not physically capable of doing the job, and so the first part of what I define as leadership, to me, is that you have to be technically excellent. You have to qualify expert with every weapon system. You have to understand tactics. You have to understand every component of being a leader. And then physically, you have to be a stud. And if you are harder than most of your soldiers, they will respect you whether you're a man or a woman. I think that in my experience, that's what soldiers related to. And in terms of, you're going to have to accept the reality that there are going to be people who are just never going to accept that, right? Like we're at a turning point in the military where this is a transition. There are combat arms leaders, soldiers who do not believe that women should be in combat arms units. And I think that in order to overcome that, you have to be better than them at everything. And the other thing is too that I think you have to be careful about the level of professionalism that you convey, and that this is I'm going to go on thin ice here. There's sort of a popular belief that women are organizers and better at sort of like social communication. And I found that the best women officers I worked for in the Army were those officers who took a very smart and thoughtful approach to problems. If you're 5 feet tall and you weigh 100 pounds and you try and physically intimidate a 6 foot tall, 200-pound guy, that's not going to work. As a male officer, you have the physical authority over a lot of your soldiers that, they may physically fear you. For women, that's not going to be the case for most of them. So technical excellence, competence, and physical fitness, to me, are the keys to proving that you belong. So, Jason.
I would say one, do it. Absolutely do it. The laws have changed for a reason. It's not just that we feel this way, it's that we're recognizing that the military was missing something by not having female combat leaders. First do it, and then two, obviously, and the combat arms is an inherently selective organization. But I would, yes, the military is a conservative organization. Brad and I were in as they were getting ready to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And some of the things I heard fellow soldiers say and senior leadership say is unbelievable. So you're going to experience bigotry and terrible things. But partially, don't put too much pressure on yourself. Again, these policies changed for a reason. That the leadership decided and realized, they decided to follow the evidence that women can do the same job. So don't feel that, kind of the point that we were making that, every Dartmouth student feels they're kind of change the world. You're going to be part of changing the world. You're not going to do it on your own. And so recognize in some ways that you're a cog in a machine of what's going to probably be a project of generational change. And unfortunately, it's probably going to take a lot of folks in the military eventually retiring to completely change the culture there. But be excellent at everything you do, but also don't put too much pressure on yourself. Follow this pathway that's been open to you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come and visit. I missed the first half because I had a class, so I apologize if you touched on this already. But if you wouldn't mind just elaborating, when you started off as second lieutenants, what was your sort of single biggest mistake when it came to leadership at the platoon level? And the thing you'd go back and change if you could. Thanks.
I think it was trying to prove your cred. So picking something you thought you were good at and you still actually weren't that good at. In my case, I'll never forget the first time I went to a range We were assigned to go to one range, and I like misread the iconic like lieutenant mistake. And my platoon sergeant was like, "This isn't a range," and I insisted on it. And I was like, "If there's one thing I know how to do, it's read a map." And like, I actually could not read that map. And so, again, like your sergeants will let you fail. And so we loaded everyone up in trucks and drove to the wrong range. And Lieutenant Hartwig got nuked by senior leadership there, who realized I was at the wrong range. So I would say you've got a grace period. And actually, the second platoon that I took over, when I took over the scout platoon, like I didn't do anything to say like I'm in charge now. I just observed for a week. I just kind of stood in the back of the formation and looked at how the organization behaved without me. And then, to Brad's point, then you start asking the questions of, well, why do you do it this particular way? And sort of ease your way into the organization. I think even after a lot of people tell you like don't go in and try and be overbearing, like you still just go do it because it's scary the first time you stand up in front of an organization like that.
For me, I would definitely say do not poo-poo garrison tasks before you get to your platoon, learning them. So, and what I mean by that is, when you join combat arms or any unit, you're like, I'm a war fighter, I'm here to lead soldiers, like I know how to lead a platoon in combat. I didn't see anybody broken for incompetence in sort of like tactical employment of their unit. I saw a lot of officers lose their careers over property management. And that is we were here at Dartmouth and doing ROTC in our senior year. We had a couple like lectures on property management in the military, and I was like, property management's stupid, whatever. And I did not understand property management when I got to my platoon. And most people in the Army do not understand property management, and you will be led astray when you get there if you do not know. You will be led astray, and if you don't know the right thing, you put yourself in serious jeopardy of getting in trouble. As a platoon leader in a light cavalry troop, I only had, $4 million of equipment. Like you probably had like 20 in a tank platoon. But $4 million is still a lot of money. And if you lose stuff, the Army takes that incredibly seriously. And the way that you learn, most people in the Army live by kind of like, it's okay, don't worry about it approach. Like, oh, the shovel's missing from this truck. Like, there's got to be another one in the motor pool. Just sign for it, it's okay. And when you're a second lieutenant, you're kind of like, oh, okay, like, so Army property books are like Excel spreadsheets, right? There's like major line items, which are like a truck, right? So Humvee. And underneath those, there are TO&E items, which are additional equipment that are attached to those major line items. So when you're a platoon leader, you get to your platoon and you have your 4 tanks, right? And you're like, well, I see 4 tanks there, I'm good. Well, under there they have, shovels, grease guns, wrenches, jacks, all these kinds of things. And if you don't know, where to find what belongs to each one of those things, those major line items, and B, verify that every single additional item is supposed to be with that thing is there, then you are signing for things that are missing. And maybe it'll work out okay for you. Maybe the next person who comes in will also not have any idea what they're doing, and they'll be like, oh, okay, like I only see 4 shovels and I have 6 trucks, but that's probably okay, and they'll sign away and then you'll be off. Or you could be like the 6 company commanders that I saw who lost $100,000 of stuff in Iraq, and got a general reprimand from, a commanding officer in Europe, and, were, disciplined, or platoon leaders that just got, eaten alive by their battalion commander for losing XYZ, you know, and they're not even sensitive items, you know, so sensitive items are like weapons or communications tools or stuff like that. So when I signed for my platoon, I was lucky. Like I got there, I signed over for it. There was no platoon leader at that time, so the platoon sergeant from another platoon sort of showed me all the stuff, and I was like, okay, most of the stuff's here, and like I'm good, and I signed for it. And I was lucky because the stuff that was missing off of my sheet was in fact in my platoon area in like a storage unit that we had that had never been opened after we got back from Iraq. But I didn't physically verify it was there. And so if you do not know property management, like you will get screwed. So make sure that you know what you're signing for, know what you're supposed to have, and everything is there. And take it seriously, because I saw so many company commanders lose their careers over missing property and people spending. We had one company commander who lost a ASIPS radio, which is like a secure radio, and she spent the remainder of her career looking for it. Seriously, she got like a below grade OER, she got a general reprimand. She spent the last 6 months of her time in the military going around from unit to unit, looking in every connex, every arms room, every truck, vehicle, any place that it could remotely be. And that was it. So.
Yeah, I think people who aren't affiliated in any way with the military would be shocked with, one, how much stuff you lose, and then two, how much time service members spend looking for stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just weeks of my life, I think, were spent looking for items that actually like didn't really matter very much in the end. But
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I have a two-part question. So one, what does Veterans Day mean to you? And two, is there something you think civilians don't completely understand about the military or the Army that you wish that people would be more aware of?
It's funny. I have a pretty It's funny, like growing up in Gettysburg, and with the sort of historical heritage I had around me. Like I always kind of enjoyed days like Memorial Day and Veterans Day, where you sort of lionize military service. I actually don't like either holiday very much anymore, because you just dwell back on the frequently the worst times. When it's a time of reflection, like you immediately go to thoughts that you've buried pretty deep. So I personally don't look forward to either Veterans Day or Memorial Day, because I essentially just think of all the worst times that I've spent a lot of time trying to get away from. In terms of what I think civilians sometimes miss is, I think Brad and I both agree that we spend too much time sort of lauding the military. That at the end of the day, the servicemen we have are professional soldiers. We are all compensated pretty well. For all the VA system is maligned, it's still like pretty fantastic care that you receive after leaving the military. There's lots of opportunities that are open to you by going to the military. And yes, the experience of war is awful, but most people who join the military don't actually experience that. The experiences Brad and I are talking about constitute the experience of, 5% of the military. So I think we actually do a disservice to those who carried the heaviest load by sort of grouping everyone who ever wore a uniform into this group of badasses running around shooting bin Laden in the face across the world. And I wish actually that we put the military back in the place that maybe it was after World War II, where everyone just went and served, and you didn't have this difference between the military class and the civilian class. And so the military had a certain degree of respect but it wasn't given anything special. I mean, I've spent the last 2 years in Somalia and haven't spent a lot of time domestically, but the first domestic flight that I took, I was surprised to see that service members are seated in first class now. And to me, that was the complete opposite of the idea of public service. And I actually found dangerous because I came from working with African militaries where we were trying to get them to move away from stuff where the military occupied this sort of privileged class within society. And so I find it alarming a little bit, actually, that we're starting to place the military on this pedestal that you get extra privileges because you're part of the warrior class.
Yeah, I guess well, I'll start off. To me, Veterans Day, a lot like Jason, I'm just kind of haunted by the families of my friends and colleagues who are killed or seriously wounded, who took traumatic brain injuries and stuff like that. Because having been to Iraq, it's just so hard to look them in the face and tell them that sacrifice was worthwhile. And I don't mean to disrespect their service, because I went too, and I believe that it was valuable, but for those guys who didn't make it home, it's just, it wears on you. So in terms of the military, I'll take a little different tack than Jason on this one. I guess the thing that I would think of, explain to people about the military is that I agree with Jason that the military should not be up on a pedestal, and that service by itself, it's just like any other organization, right? There are good people, there are bad people, there are heroes and cowards and everything in between. And that's not going to be any different whatever world you choose to be employed in. Like, if you're at Dartmouth and you think that going to work for an NGO in Africa is just going to be amazing people doing good things and they're all great and it's wonderful, well, that's not going to be the reality. There are plenty of people in that world who are more intent on letting people know that they're making a difference than they are on making a difference. And in terms of the military, it's no different. Service by itself doesn't mean anything to me. Just the fact that you joined up, plenty of people join up just to pay for college or burnish their credentials for their future political careers. So I agree with Jason that the service by itself doesn't signify anything, and that we should be careful about how we lionize a whole class of people without sort of examining the merits of it. But at the same time, for anyone who's deployed, the toll that it takes on them and their families is incomprehensible to most civilians. And the sacrifice that they make is real and ruinous to a lot of people. And that has to be recognized and at least respected. So. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out.